They sold the Apache widow with the cattle until the rancher said, "She's priceless." She stood at the edge of the dusty field just after sunrise, the cold air clinging to her skin like a memory she could not shake. The ground beneath her feet was hard and dry, cracked from years without mercy. Around her, cattle shifted and snorted, their chains clinking softly as men moved among them. The sound reminded her of drums from long ago, but these were not sounds of life or celebration. These were sounds of trade, of money changing hands, of things being counted and claimed. Only a few weeks earlier, she had still been a wife. Her husband had been strong, quiet, and careful. He had taught her how to read the land, how to listen to the wind, how to survive without begging. When sickness took him, it did not come loudly. It came like a shadow at dusk, slow and final. One morning, he simply did not wake up. By nightfall, the world had already begun to move on without him. In their world, a woman without a husband was like a fence without posts. She could stand for a while, but everyone believed she would fall. Some offered pity, others offered nothing at all. What she did not expect was to be treated as something that could be added to a sale, like an old saddle or a broken tool. She had been told to come with the cattle. No explanation, no discussion, just a short command from a man who would not meet her eyes. She followed because she had learned that refusing only brought worse trouble. Her heart was heavy, but her face remained calm. She had cried enough tears alone at night. There were none left for strangers. The auction ground was busy now. Men gathered in small groups, talking loudly, laughing, spitting into the dirt. Coins clinked in pockets. Boots scraped the ground. The smell of animals, sweat, and dust filled the air. She stood slightly apart, hands folded in front of her, eyes lowered. She knew better than to draw attention. People noticed her anyway. Some looked at her with surprise, others with confusion. A few smiled in ways that made her skin crawl. No one spoke to her directly. They spoke about her instead, as if she were deaf or less than human. "She comes with the lot," one voice said casually. "Why?" another asked. "Widow, no family to take her." Those words landed heavier than any blow. Widow, no family, as if her past, her love, her grief could be reduced to a single sentence. She remembered the night she and her husband had sat by the fire, planning for the coming winter. He had promised her safety. He had promised that as long as he breathed, no one would ever treat her like this. That promise echoed painfully in her chest now, not because he had broken it, but because death had taken his place. The auctioneer climbed onto a small platform, calling for attention. His voice was loud and practiced, trained to carry over noise and distance. He spoke of numbers, of weight, of quality. The cattle were described carefully, their worth measured in clear terms. When his eyes briefly flicked toward her, his tone changed. "And the woman goes with them," he said, as if mentioning an extra rope. "No additional cost." A few people laughed. She felt heat rise to her face, but she did not move. Inside, something twisted painfully, a mix of shame and anger and fear. She was not surprised. Hurt, yes, but not surprised. The world had already shown her how quickly a person could become invisible once protection was gone. She focused on breathing, slow and steady, the way her mother had taught her when panic threatened to take over. In through the nose, out through the mouth. She told herself she was still alive. She told herself she still had strength, even if no one else could see it. The bidding began. Hands went up. Numbers were shouted. The sound of bargaining filled the air. Cattle were pushed forward, examined, prodded. The men looked serious now, focused on profit. She remained still, trying not to imagine what would happen when the sale was done. She did not know who would take her, or where she would be sent, or what would be expected of her. The unknown pressed on her chest like a weight. She wondered if this was how her life would end, not in death, but in being passed from one hand to another, slowly losing herself until nothing remained. She lifted her eyes only once briefly, scanning the crowd. Faces blurred together. Most showed indifference. Some showed interest that felt dangerous. Then her gaze landed on a man who was not shouting or laughing. He stood a little apart, watching. He was dressed like the others, worn clothes, dust on his boots, but his posture was different. He was still attentive, his eyes moving not just over the cattle but over the people. When his gaze met hers, he did not look away. He did not smile. He did not judge. He simply looked as if trying to understand something that did not make sense. Her breath caught for a moment. She quickly lowered her eyes again. Hope was a dangerous thing. She had learned that lesson early in life. Hope could make you careless. Hope could make the fall hurt more. The bidding slowed. The auctioneer prepared to close the sale. The men around her leaned forward, ready to finish the deal and move on. To them, this was just another morning's work. To her, it felt like the edge of a cliff. She thought of her husband's voice, calm and steady. She thought of the stories of her people, of women who endured loss and still walked forward. She reminded herself that whatever happened next, she would survive it. She had survived worse. The auctioneer raised his hand to signal the final call. The air felt tight, as if the world itself was holding its breath. And in that moment, just before the hammer could fall, she felt it, an unseen shift. A pause that did not belong to her fear, but to someone else's decision. She did not know yet that this pause would change everything. She only knew that for the first time since her husband's death, the silence felt different, less like an ending, and more like the moment before a storm breaks. The silence did not last long, but it was enough to change the direction of the day. The rancher shifted his weight and took one step forward. It was a small movement, almost unnoticeable, yet something about it felt heavy, like a stone dropped into still water. The men closest to him glanced over, then back to the auctioneer, unsure if they had imagined it. The widow felt it before she understood it, a change in the air. The tight pressure in her chest eased just a little, as if someone had opened a window in a room that had been closed for too long. She kept her eyes down, but her senses sharpened. Years of survival had taught her to notice when danger approached and when something unexpected appeared. The auctioneer cleared his throat and repeated the final price, raising his hand again. "Last call," he said, his voice confident. He had done this thousands of times. Nothing ever interrupted the flow of a sale. "Wait." The word cut through the noise like a blade. Heads turned. Conversation stopped. The auctioneer froze mid-motion. The rancher's voice was calm, not loud, but firm enough that it carried. He stepped closer now, standing where everyone could see him. His face showed no anger, but there was a seriousness in his eyes that made people pay attention. "What is it?" the auctioneer asked, forcing a smile. The rancher did not answer right away. His eyes moved, not over the cattle, but to the woman standing among them. He studied her posture, the way she held herself straight despite the fear that must have been burning inside. He noticed her hands, steady, not shaking. He noticed the quiet strength in her stillness. "She is part of the sale?" he asked. A few men chuckled. "That's right," someone said. "Comes with the lot." The rancher frowned slightly. "By whose decision?" The laughter faded. No one answered immediately. The auctioneer shifted uncomfortably. "Her husband's gone," he said at last. "No one left to claim responsibility. It's simpler this way." "Simpler for who?" the rancher asked. The question hung in the air. Some men looked away. Others crossed their arms, annoyed. One muttered that the rancher was wasting time. Business was business, after all. The widow listened without lifting her head. She had heard these kinds of conversations before. People spoke about responsibility as if it were ownership, as if a woman existed only when attached to someone else. Her heart beat slowly but hard. She did not expect rescue. She had learned not to expect it. Still, something inside her leaned toward the sound of that steady voice. The rancher took another step forward. "Did she agree to this?" he asked. The auctioneer laughed nervously. "Agree? She was told, that's enough." The rancher's jaw tightened. He looked around at the crowd. "Has anyone asked her what she wants?" Silence again. This time it was heavier. The widow felt dozens of eyes turn toward her. Heat rushed to her face. For a moment, fear threatened to root her to the ground. Speaking had never been safe for her. Silence had kept her alive more than once, but something about the way the rancher stood there, unmoving, waiting, made her lift her head slowly. She met his gaze. There was no pity in his eyes, no hunger, no claim. Only a quiet question, as if he were saying, "You are here, I see you." Her throat tightened. Words gathered, then fell apart. She swallowed and shook her head once. It was a small movement, but it felt like a shout inside her chest. No. The rancher nodded, as if that single gesture had answered everything he needed to know. "That settles it," he said. A murmur spread through the crowd. Some protested, others scoffed. One man accused him of trying to show off. Another warned him not to interfere. The auctioneer raised his voice, trying to regain control. "If you're not bidding, step back," he said sharply. The rancher did not move. "I am bidding," he said calmly, "on the cattle only." The auctioneer hesitated. "The lot includes—" "I will pay for the cattle," the rancher repeated, "not the woman." The crowd erupted in argument. Voices overlapped. Someone shouted that rules were rules. Another said the rancher was inviting trouble. The widow stood frozen, her heart pounding so loudly she thought everyone could hear it. She did not know what would happen next. She only knew that for the first time that day, someone was speaking for her without trying to own her. The auctioneer wiped sweat from his brow. He looked at the men, then back at the rancher. Money mattered, reputation mattered. A scene like this was bad for both. Finally, with clear irritation, he nodded. "Fine," he snapped. "Cattle only." Relief swept through the widow so suddenly that her knees nearly gave out. She forced herself to stay upright. This was not over. She knew better than to believe that one moment could erase danger. Still, the ground beneath her felt a little more solid than it had minutes ago. The bidding resumed, tense and quick. The rancher outbid the others without hesitation. He did not boast. He did not smile. He simply did what needed to be done. When the sale was complete, he paid without complaint and signed the papers. The cattle were led away, their chains clinking as before, but this time the sound felt different to her. Lighter, less threatening. When it was done, the auctioneer turned to her. "You can go," he said curtly, as if dismissing an inconvenience. She did not move. "Go where?" The rancher noticed her hesitation. He approached slowly, stopping a respectful distance away. "You don't owe anyone anything here," he said quietly. "You're free to choose your next step. Free." The word felt strange in her ears. She had not heard it spoken to her in a long time. She looked around. The crowd was already losing interest, drifting back to their business. No one was offering help. No one was offering shelter. Freedom without direction could be as frightening as captivity. The rancher seemed to understand. "If you need time," he added, "you can come with me, not as property, not as a debt, just until you decide what you want to do." She studied him carefully. Trust did not come easily to her, but his tone held no pressure, only an open door. The choice was hers. After a long moment, she nodded once. As they walked away from the auction ground, the sun climbed higher, warming the dust beneath their feet. She did not know what waited ahead. She only knew that the path behind her was finally closed, and for the first time since her husband's death, her future felt like something she might shape with her own hands. The journey away from the auction ground felt longer than it truly was. Each step carried the widow farther from the place where she had almost lost herself, yet her body remained tense, as if danger might still reach out and pull her back. She walked a few paces behind the rancher, careful not to assume anything. He had opened a door for her, yes, but she had lived long enough to know that doors could close just as quickly. The rancher did not rush her. He led his horse slowly, matching her pace. The land stretched wide around them, open and quiet, the noise of the auction fading into the distance. Dust rose with each step, glowing softly in the sunlight. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Her thoughts raced. She wondered if she should thank him, but the words felt heavy. Gratitude could turn into obligation, and obligation often became a chain. She did not want to trade one kind of control for another. As if sensing her unease, the rancher spoke first. "My name is Thomas," he said simply. "You don't have to answer if you don't want to." She appreciated that. After a few steps, she replied quietly, "I know who I am." It was not a name, but it was the truth. He nodded, accepting it without question. They reached his wagon, parked beneath the shade of a tall tree. He untied a water pouch and offered it to her, holding it out without stepping closer. She hesitated, then took it, drinking slowly. The cool water steadied her hands. When she returned it, she met his eyes briefly. "Thank you," she said. He inclined his head. "You don't owe me anything." Those words mattered more than he probably realized. They traveled through open land as the day wore on. The sun climbed higher and the road grew rougher. Thomas spoke only when necessary, pointing out stones or uneven ground. He did not ask questions about her past. He did not try to fill the silence. That restraint made her feel safer than any promise could have. By late afternoon, the ranch came into view. It was modest but well kept, surrounded by fencing that had clearly been repaired many times. There was no grand house, no display of wealth, just a home built to last. She noticed the small details: tools arranged neatly, water barrels covered to keep out dirt, animals fed and calm. This was a place shaped by care, not force. Thomas showed her where she could rest. "You can stay in the small room near the kitchen," he said. "Or outside if you prefer, whatever feels right." She chose the room. It was simple, with a narrow bed and a small window that let in light. She sat on the edge of the mattress, unsure what to do next. The quiet felt strange after so much fear and noise. When Thomas left her alone, she listened carefully, half expecting someone to come back and demand something from her. No one did. That night, sleep came in short pieces. Memories surfaced without warning: the auctioneer's voice, the laughter, her husband's still face. Each time she woke, she reminded herself where she was: safe for now, free for now. In the days that followed, she learned the rhythm of the ranch. Thomas rose early and worked until sunset. He never ordered her to do anything. When she offered to help, he accepted with a nod, showing her tasks that were light and straightforward: feeding animals, carrying water, sorting tools. The work gave her a sense of balance she had been missing. They spoke more, but still carefully. He told her about the land, about storms that had tested it, about mistakes he had made and learned from. He never spoke of the auction unless she brought it up. She noticed that he listened more than he talked, as if he understood that silence could be a form of respect. Trust grew slowly, like a plant pushing through dry soil. She watched how he treated others who came to the ranch: workers, travelers, neighbors. He was firm but fair. He paid what he promised. He did not raise his voice without reason. These small, steady actions told her more than grand speeches ever could. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky with soft colors, she finally spoke of her husband. She told Thomas how he had died quietly without pain and how the world had changed the moment he was gone. Her voice shook, but she did not stop. Thomas listened without interruption. When she finished, he said only, "I'm sorry for your loss." No advice, no judgment, just acknowledgement. That night, she slept more deeply than she had in weeks. As time passed, she began to reclaim parts of herself she thought were lost. She braided her hair the way her mother had taught her. She sang softly while working, songs that carried memories of her people and their strength. She stood a little taller. Then one afternoon, trouble arrived at the gate. Two men rode up, their faces tight with irritation. They spoke loudly, demanding to see Thomas. She watched from a distance as they argued, recognizing the tone immediately. It was the sound of entitlement. "She belongs to the sale," one man said. "You had no right." Thomas's voice remained calm. "She belongs to herself." The men scoffed. "That's not how things work." Fear stirred in her chest. Old instincts urged her to hide to make herself small, but another part of her, the part that had lifted her head at the auction, refused to disappear. She stepped forward. Both men turned, surprised. She met their gaze steadily. "I chose to leave," she said clearly. "No one owns me." The men stared, then laughed, uncomfortable. They muttered threats, warnings about consequences. Thomas stood beside her, silent but solid. After a tense moment, the men rode away, throwing dust into the air. Her hands trembled after they were gone. Thomas noticed but did not comment. Instead, he said, "You did well." That night, she understood something important. Freedom was not just being released from chains. It was also the courage to speak, to stand, to claim space. She still did not know what her future would be, but she knew this. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer an extra added to someone else's profit. She was a woman rebuilding her life, one careful step at a time. And somewhere deep inside, a quiet strength was waking up, stronger than fear, stronger than loss, and ready to carry her forward. The days at the ranch became a rhythm, slow but steady, like a river carving its way through the land. The widow woke each morning to the soft sound of birds, the distant lowing of cattle, and the faint creak of the wind in the trees. At first, each sound was foreign, unfamiliar, almost frightening in its calmness. She had spent so long surrounded by fear and chaos that peace felt strange. Yet, with each passing sunrise, it began to settle into her bones, like a warmth she had forgotten. Thomas never demanded anything of her. He offered tasks if she wished to help, explained them clearly, and then stepped back. The work was simple, practical, and honest. Carrying buckets of water, feeding the chickens, mending fences, sweeping the dusty floors, and tending to the garden. At first, she worked quietly, careful not to overstep or appear intrusive. But slowly, she began to move with confidence, learning the rhythm of the ranch, understanding how things functioned and how her own hands could contribute. During this time, conversations were limited. Thomas spoke when necessary, mostly about work or the land. He never pressed her for stories about the past unless she offered them. This was new for her, someone who could stand near and listen without demanding, without judgment, without the need to control. She found herself talking more, hesitantly at first, about her life with her husband, the lessons she had learned, and the small joys she remembered. Each word she spoke built trust, little by little. The nights were still the hardest. Alone in her small room, memories of the auction and her husband returned in vivid detail. She often sat by the window, staring at the stars, feeling the weight of loneliness pressing on her chest. But now there was also safety, a presence that did not demand her silence. She could cry, remember, and still know that she would not be punished for it. Slowly, she allowed herself to hope, not recklessly but carefully, like a seed planted in soil that had been prepared for growth. One evening, Thomas noticed her sitting by the garden, the sun low in the sky. He handed her a small basket of vegetables harvested that day. "These are for you," he said, simple and kind. She accepted them, unsure of how to respond. Gratitude felt like a foreign language, yet the gesture stirred something inside her, a sense of being seen and valued not for what she could be sold for, but for who she was. Time passed, and their bond deepened quietly. She observed Thomas as he interacted with others, visitors, neighbors, and workers. He was firm, fair, and consistent. No one could take advantage of him, and no one could harm those under his protection. Watching him, she began to understand that true strength did not need to dominate. It could exist in calmness and fairness. It was a lesson she had not known she needed. One day, while repairing a fence, she slipped slightly and fell. Her hand scraped against the rough wood, drawing a thin line of blood. Thomas appeared instantly, helping her up without a word of reproach. He offered a clean cloth and some water, tending to her hands carefully. She felt a warmth she had not known in months, safety not forced upon her but freely given. She realized that care could exist without obligation, without expectation. It could simply be an act of human kindness. Her confidence grew slowly. She began tending to the animals on her own, feeding the chickens, filling water troughs, and even calming the younger calves when they grew restless. Thomas watched, sometimes offering guidance but never hovering. The widow learned not only to survive but to thrive in this small, deliberate space of freedom. One afternoon, a small incident tested both her courage and the trust she had built. Two men arrived at the ranch, riding up aggressively. Their voices were loud, demanding to see Thomas. The widow recognized the tone immediately. It was the same commanding, entitled voice from the auction. Her heart leapt into her throat, panic rising, but she did not run. Something inside her whispered that this time would be different. The men dismounted roughly, arguing that the woman belonged to the sale, that Thomas had no right to interfere. They were loud, insistent, and their presence alone carried the weight of threat. The widow felt fear tighten around her chest, the old instinct to make herself small returning. But she also felt something new, a quiet strength, rooted in the days she had spent building trust, learning her own worth and experiencing genuine kindness. She stepped forward. Her voice was clear, not loud but firm. "I chose to leave," she said. "No one owns me." The men blinked, startled. Such defiance from someone they considered property was unexpected. They muttered threats, tried to intimidate her, but the sight of Thomas standing beside her, calm and steady, made them pause. They eventually left, murmuring complaints, raising dust behind them. When the dust settled, the widow realized she was still standing, unharmed, and for the first time it felt like victory, not over others, but over the fear that had haunted her for so long. That night, sitting by the window, she reflected on everything that had happened. She thought of the auction, the moment Thomas had intervened, the days of slow, deliberate work at the ranch, and the encounter with the men. She realized that freedom was not only about being physically safe. It was about feeling safe enough to trust, to act, to speak, and to live fully. The lessons she had learned over a lifetime, resilience, caution, patience, were now joined by a new understanding. Strength could be gentle, protection could be offered without control, and human dignity could be honored even in a harsh world. She began to take small steps toward a life she could claim as her own. She helped in the garden, planting seeds, watering plants, and caring for them as carefully as she had learned to care for herself. She sang quietly while working, letting the melodies carry the memories of her people, their songs of endurance, and the stories her husband had once told her. Slowly, the fear that had been lodged in her chest for so long loosened its grip, replaced by quiet determination. Thomas continued to be a steady presence, never forcing her to act or speak before she was ready. He respected her space, her choices, and her pace. Sometimes he offered advice, sometimes just a smile, but always with patience. This consistent respect taught her that human connection did not have to come with chains, that trust could be built on small, daily actions rather than grand gestures. Months passed, and the widow became more than a visitor at the ranch. She became part of its rhythm, a worker, a learner, and a companion. Her confidence grew, her laughter returned in small, genuine moments, and the fear that had once dominated her life began to fade into memory. She began to dream quietly about a future not dictated by others, about a life where she could make her own choices, where her worth was recognized without payment, where her voice mattered. And still, she knew the past was never far away. The auction, the loss of her husband, and the men who had once tried to claim her were all shadows that lingered. But she understood now that the shadows could not control her anymore. She had found strength in kindness, courage in trust, and freedom in choice. By the end of that year, as the leaves turned golden and the ranch prepared for winter, she stood in the garden, looking at the vegetables she had tended with care. The air was crisp, the sky vast and open, and for the first time she felt the possibility of hope, not fragile, not fleeting, but real and steady. She realized that this was more than survival. This was life reclaimed. This was dignity restored. And it was hers, fully and without apology. She smiled softly to herself, knowing that the lessons of the past had brought her here, to a place where she could finally be seen, respected, and valued, not as property, not as a widow, but as a woman who had endured and survived, ready to shape the rest of her life with her own hands. Winter approached slowly, bringing with it cold winds that swept across the open land. The ranch seemed quieter now, the cattle huddled together, and the trees swayed gently in the chill. For the widow, this season felt different. The quiet was no longer frightening, it was comforting. She had learned the rhythm of the ranch, understood her place, and discovered strength she had not known she possessed. Yet she also understood that the world beyond the fence was still uncertain, still filled with people who might not recognize her right to freedom. She spent the mornings working with the animals, feeding them, checking for injuries, and keeping their living spaces clean. The afternoons were quieter, moments when she could repair fences, organize supplies, or tend the small garden. Sometimes she would sit by the window in her room, looking out at the horizon, thinking of the past and imagining a future she could finally call her own. These were small moments of peace, but each one mattered deeply. They were proof that she could live on her own terms. Thomas never treated her as anything less than capable. He continued to give her choices, showing her the routines of the ranch and letting her decide how to help. The widow began to feel a sense of ownership over her days, the first she had felt since her husband's death. Slowly she discovered that she was not just surviving, she was thriving. Each day brought small victories, fixing a fence, calming a restless calf, learning a new skill that built confidence she had long thought lost. One afternoon, the peace was interrupted by the arrival of strangers. Two riders appeared at the edge of the ranch, their horses kicking up dust. They dismounted roughly, calling out loudly and demanding to speak to Thomas. The widow's heart tightened. She had seen this before, men who believed that women like her could be claimed, bought, or threatened. Fear stirred inside her, but it no longer had the same power it once had. She was no longer alone, and she had learned the quiet strength of standing her ground. The men approached Thomas aggressively, arguing that the widow belonged to the sale from months ago, that the rancher had no right to protect her. Their voices were harsh, full of entitlement and assumptions. The widow stepped forward, remembering the courage that had carried her through the auction and the days of hard work at the ranch. Her voice was clear, firm, and calm. "I am not property," she said. "I chose to leave. I am free." The men blinked, surprised. Their certainty faltered in the face of her determination. They muttered threats and tried to intimidate her, but Thomas stood firmly by her side, silent and steady. His presence was a shield, a reminder that she was no longer alone, that she had allies who respected her autonomy. Eventually, the men rode away, grumbling and unsettled. When the dust settled, the widow realized she had not only survived the encounter, but had also asserted her rights, her voice carrying weight where it once would have been ignored. That evening, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She thought of her husband, of the auction, of the days spent quietly learning to trust and work alongside Thomas. She realized that freedom was not only the absence of chains, but also the ability to act, to choose, and to speak for herself. Each decision she had made, from stepping forward against the men to tending the animals, was a claim on her life. She was no longer just surviving, she was living. The weeks turned into months, and the widow's confidence continued to grow. She became more than a helper on the ranch. She became a valued presence, capable and respected. She learned to ride a horse more confidently, to manage her own tasks without guidance, and to make decisions that affected the daily life of the ranch. She began to understand that life could be shaped by her own hands, that the choices she made mattered, and that her value was not measured by the judgment of others, but by her own sense of dignity. Word eventually spread of her story. People in nearby towns and settlements began to talk about the woman who had been freed from the auction and was now living independently on the ranch. Some were skeptical, others admiring, but the widow no longer needed the approval of strangers. She had found her own place, her own voice, and her own strength. The attention of outsiders mattered little compared to the knowledge that she could now live on her own terms. One crisp winter morning she stood in the garden, the soil cold under her hands, planting seeds for the next season. The land stretched wide before her, open and full of possibilities. She reflected on how far she had come, from a widow standing silently beside the cattle at the auction, feeling invisible and powerless, to a woman who could assert her rights, make her own choices, and shape her own life. The memory of fear still lingered, but it was a shadow, no longer a chain. Thomas approached quietly, standing a few feet away as she worked. "You've done well," he said softly. "You've earned this life and no one can take it from you." She looked up, meeting his eyes, and felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the cold air. For the first time in months, she smiled fully without fear or hesitation. She understood that this life, simple, quiet, and filled with freedom, was a treasure. It had been built with patience, courage, and the careful trust she had cultivated. Days turned to weeks and winter deepened. The ranch, once quiet and uncertain, now thrived with routine, effort, and care. The widow no longer felt like an outsider. She knew the rhythm of the land, the needs of the animals, and the subtle signs of weather and nature. She had learned that strength was quiet and consistent, that courage was choosing to act despite fear, and that freedom was claiming one's own voice and life. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, she stood at the edge of the field. The wind carried the scent of earth and animals, a reminder of the life she now lived. She reflected on the auction, the men who tried to claim her, and the journey that had brought her to this moment. Each step, each choice, each act of courage had led her here. She was no longer a widow being traded, no longer invisible, no longer defined by loss or fear. She was a woman who had reclaimed her life. She turned toward the ranch house, where Thomas worked quietly, tending to the last tasks of the day. She felt a profound sense of peace. She had found a home, a sanctuary, and a life where she was seen, respected, and valued. The past had shaped her, but it did not control her. The future was hers to shape, full of possibility, strength, and dignity. For the first time in years, she felt truly free. Not free because someone else had released her, but free because she had claimed her life, her voice, and her choices. And as the stars appeared one by one in the evening sky, she understood something deeply. The story of her survival was not just about escaping chains or danger. It was about discovering her own power, embracing her worth, and living fully as herself. She smiled softly, a quiet, knowing smile. The journey had been long, painful, and uncertain, but it had led her to this place of peace, safety, and freedom. And she would carry it forward, step by step, choice by choice, with the strength and dignity that had always been hers, even when the world tried to deny it.